Improving Hyper-V Cloud Security with Host-Based Management Solutions. Hello everyone, my name is Greg Shields and I'm an MVP and also a V-Expert. I'm also a Senior Partner and Principal Technologist with Concentrated Technology. That's concentratedtech.com. And I want to thank Five9 for giving me the opportunity to talk with you today about just some of the new security techniques that seem to be coming out of the virtualization world these days, and particularly in Hyper-V. And not only just Hyper-V, but also the whole inclusion of Hyper-V into cloud computing, both private cloud computing and also most specifically public cloud computing. It's interesting because the move of Hyper-V from sort of its early form as sort of a basic virtualization solution into this fully featured and cloud-enabled platform has in a lot of ways changed some of the techniques that are required in order to assure security. And if you're a hosting provider, or if you're even an enterprise IT organization, you're doing private cloud computing, and you've got multiple different clients or multiple different groups of users, the whole techniques in which you implement security kind of have to evolve just a bit. And I think I'll argue over the next few minutes that there are some host-based approaches that kind of improve the entire process. So I want to start really by talking about Hyper-V in relation to just the security tasks that are required for virtual machines in a Hyper-V environment. So let's think about the typical hosting provider environment, and even again, some of those enterprise IT environments that have multiple different customers. So you are providing a service for different users, for different clients, and then in and amongst those users and clients, you have to be able to set up an environment that allows those clients to do whatever it is they need to do, so to operate the workloads that sit on top of those virtual machines, but at the same time also segregating individual clients from each other. So the tasks in virtual machine security are obviously firewalling and network filtering. And so I have to be able to set up some sort of firewall that prevents traffic from going across different clients that don't need to see that, and also firewalling from the client out to the internet or whatever next hop network connection those virtual machines have. I've also got to implement some sort of intrusion detection or intrusion prevention solution as well. And these things can get relatively complex, especially in that provider situation, because you've got to be able to firewall, obviously, but at the same time, you've also got to watch for those ports that you've opened up to make sure that there's nothing bad coming in. Without IDS and IPS, it's an open or a closed. At least this way, with IDS, IPS, and also anti-malware scanning, you can take a look at the different configuration on the computer and then what the traffic is going in and out of that computer. Now, if you think about how Hyper-V today is managed and the security settings inside of Hyper-V, many of those techniques are very virtual machine centric. Right? So you need to go and apply some sort of policy to virtual machines. Well, you apply the policy generally to that virtual machine in that Hyper-V environment. Oftentimes this is used by or facilitated by group policy, for example. Now, what's interesting is that these tasks, these VM-centric tasks that relate to security, well, there's an argument that VM centrism is really not a really good security-friendly approach for dealing with security. Right? So when I say VM centrism, so the idea of the virtual machine as being the configuration item for security, as opposed to the host, for example. Now, the tools that we have are fairly VM-centric, the native tools, in the way that they operate. The Windows Firewall with Advanced Security does firewalling and network filtering and some very rudimentary IDS and IPS. Tends to be group policy controllable, but the mechanisms that you would use to manage your Windows Firewall are fairly challenging when you may not necessarily have group policy control. You, as the hosting provider, won't have group policy control over those settings. Right? You're providing some sort of service for clients, again, either internal or external. Well, if you don't actually have the control via group policy, well, dealing with the Windows Firewall means that you might not have the control that you're looking for. Same thing goes with Windows Update. Right? So Windows Update provides anti-malware scanning. It provides update scanning. It is also group policy controllable. It doesn't patch non-Microsoft applications. But if you don't have that policy delivery mechanism at your disposal, well, you've got to deal with some virtual machine agent, or you've got to deal with some other tool that arguably a lot of times tends to be very VM-centric in the way it deploys out those policies. And this is really not a good thing when you're the provider and you just don't simply have the access. So what's missing from the Windows firewall? Right, the Windows comes, all the modern versions of Windows comes with a Windows firewall. It's called Windows Firewall with Advanced Security. It provides protections for the Hyper-V host, provides protections for the VMs as well, but is not easily manageable for those virtual machines. So the firewall itself doesn't have really good packet inspection. There are filtering rules, but they can be somewhat challenging to apply in a global sense. If you are standing outside of those organizations, it can be almost impossible to apply. There's really no way to aggregate the logs, the traffic logs from each individual firewall without some sort of external mechanism that collects all of those logs. The logs tend to be very VM-centric as well. The firewall does not do really good bandwidth utilization control. There are some throttling tools that are in there. There may not necessarily be Windows Firewall centric, but as you go and increase your level of consolidation of virtual machines, which you are incentivized to do because more VMs per host just means more capacity per host, you need to have some ability to throttle that bandwidth to protect the actions of one VM from another. And if that's not provided from the Windows Firewall, you need to have some other solution that does that. What's also missing from the Windows Firewall is a programmatic exposure that you can distribute across multiple different virtual machines, multiple different hosts. So from a single location, there's not really a good mechanism for you to distribute out policies via some programmatic interface. Now, this actually can become problematic from a couple different perspectives. So in the first perspective, you need to provide the assurance to other customers that customer A is not manipulating their firewall so that they can see things, or accidentally sending customer A data to customer B. You need to support that, so you have to have the good walls between each customer in that multi-tenant scenario. You also need to provide for, within each customer, the mechanisms that allow them to control their own firewall settings. And so having some sort of custom control, that programmatic exposure, enables you to provide the internal support for internally firewalling within that customer, and also the segregation of tenants from each other. Lastly, in many ways, most importantly, there is the need to pass or to deal with inter-VM traffic, so traffic between two VMs on the same host, with the same level of effort and the same level of configuration control that you have traffic going in, down, and out of VMs. Now, the Windows Firewall all by itself does not support that. It's just not something that's easily accomplished. There's an argument, too, that as virtual machines fail over or load balance in an environment, there needs to be some sort of live migration support that enables your policies to be consistently applied no matter where they're at. If you apply a policy on one host, if the virtual machine is gaining some of its settings from that host and it ends up failing over to a different host, do you have the assurance that that virtual machine settings, the firewall settings, the other security settings are being consistently applied? Your firewall settings need to follow those VMs. So if you're looking for a host-based approach, a centralized approach, you have to have one that enable those firewall settings to follow virtual machines around that environment as failovers occur or as load balancing events occur. And this is not something that's easily done right out of the box. There is an argument as well that having some sort of central control over firewall settings is also relatively important. Right? You call it a security heartbeat. Call this a solution that allows the virtual machine to positively report that its settings are being configured appropriately. Okay? In that tenant environment where you have multiple different customers on the same cluster, you really have to have that positive verification, because if something goes awry and some configuration gets ignored or goes non-applicable, or a user somehow gets around some controls that you have, you need the ability to know that that machine is no longer healthy as it relates to what your security profile is. Now, missing from the Windows firewall is exactly that proactive heartbeat that would occur between the security settings, I think I say the firewall up here on the screen, and your central management solution. Okay, there's just no mechanism in place in Windows Firewall to provide that heartbeat. So without that, you just don't have really central control through a very easy mechanism. Now, what could such a heartbeat actually do? So let's flip that whole situation on its head and say, all right, well, if I had a heartbeat, what kinds of things might that heartbeat provide? And first and foremost is the positive verification of that functionality of the firewall. You have to make sure that the firewall's up so that you don't end up bleeding the traffic from one VM into another. You have to ensure that your rules are being enforced. Right? With group policy alone, group policy deploys out policies, but the actual understanding if those policies are actually functioning or not, the verification, the validation that the policies are happening is something that group policy does not do very well. So when you have some sort of alternative solution that provides that central control, it can ensure that your rules are being enforced, and that's kind of a good warm fuzzy for your clients. You may also have the need to stop or pause VMs should your traffic filters become non-responsive. Okay, that's a pretty heavy-handed tactic, but if you have the situation where client A may potentially be bleeding into client B, well, you want to be able to protect the other clients that they're maybe not part of the problem. More important than anything, the assurance that a virtual machine is not going to be inadvertently compromised because the firewall is not being deployed or managed appropriately. So that central management solution really can provide a central control for how you manage those virtual machines. Another tactic that makes the whole management of multiple VMs across multiple clients much, much better is the relocation of the profile deployment. So I need to send out a security profile to different machines. If I relocate that deployment away from the VM and towards the host, this can eliminate the need for having agents inside the virtual machine. Right? So I don't have to deploy out a bunch of agents to virtual machines. Again, I may not necessarily even control the content of those virtual machines. And so because of that, I have a much better tool with which to support the needs of my users without being too much involved with them. And I want to be able to kind of stand back and let them do what they need, and I just provide the infrastructure for them. It also centralizes control of the communication between VMs on the same host. Right, so if I've got traffic that's occurring over that Hyper-V virtual switch, I want to be able to control that in the same ways that I do traffic that's going out of the virtual switch onto the rest of the network. And controlling that switch at the host level is the only place where I can really have the visibility and also the control into the communication paths between those virtual machines. I want also to make better use of the host virtual switch that Hyper-V has. So contrast Hyper-V, or at least early Hyper-V, to some of its competitors. And if you look, the virtual switch that Hyper-V has was in many ways very simplistic in the early days in comparison with what we can see now in some of its competition. And we're seeing some improvements in recent versions with this host vSwitch and really elevating Hyper-V and the capacity, the capabilities of its vSwitch towards something that supports enterprise needs and supports the needs for multi-tenancy scenarios. Really what we're looking for here is improving that overall control. And so I have a management server. From that management server, I can send out configurations to individual hosts. Those individual hosts then represent those configurations into the virtual machines. The integration then of the firewall control with the other things that are required for Hyper-V security, anti-malware management, reporting, provisioning of signatures, updates, all of these other pieces of the security whole can all be integrated in together if I have, again, that single central solution that provides for all of my needs. Now, at the end of the day, really what you're looking for is a solution that facilitates and also assures compliance. And that can mean regulatory compliance or industry compliance. particularly in the private cloud, in the internal IT, enterprise IT scenario, but more so in the hosting situation. What we're talking about is not so much compliance with the regulations, but compliance with whatever agreements we've put together between us and our clients. So us and the people, the customers that we're providing services for. You can't in good conscience provide a solution, a hosting solution for customers if you don't have the technological pieces in place and the procedural pieces in place to assure the technology so that, again, customer A and customer B ever end up communicating with each other. That's really, really a bad day. So this whole notion of relocating the point of control out of the virtual machine brings you as the provider a number of specific benefits. Right? You control the host, even if you may or may not control the individual virtual machine. And so pulling these security settings back to the host becomes fundamentally important for being able to provide those services that you are to your customers without having to create separate clusters for each customer. Right? And then you don't enjoy economies of scale in having to do that. With that host-centric approach, you have the ability to aggregate security control across multiple tenants. So from a single pane of glass, you can see what you configured for each individual tenant. Provides the security between virtual machines. Right? If I have a customer in a completely unmanaged scenario that accidentally just shuts the firewall down, well, there is the potential for traffic from another customer to become visible by that customer doing the bad thing. So you have to provide that inter-VM security between VMs on the same host. You have to also assure, as I mentioned in the last slide, that security policies are indeed applied and applied consistently as they move around that cluster for whatever reason they do. So focusing on the host ensures that that is the case. Most importantly, you also have to recognize that any sort of agent-based solution can have an inappropriate tax on resources. Right? As your level of consolidation goes up, the distribution of those agents can actually have an impact on the amount of resources you have for running the production workload. So focusing on the host reduces what that overhead is. At the end of the day, everything just runs a little faster because you're not consuming resources for a management tool. You also, with a host-centric approach, can have that programmatic control for your security settings. So from the host perspective, I can send commands that enable those hosts to be configured. That from there into the virtual machines, I can then control everything consistently. And I can also create whatever those custom controls are that I want to provide to my end customer. And then lastly, it also simplifies the anti-malware deployment across different customers and arguably also the update deployment across different customers as well. You know, as a provider, really the most important facet here is protecting you as the provider from inappropriate actions on the part of your customers. You know, if a customer goes and does something that is bad and causes them to sniff traffic from somewhere else or expose their own traffic to someone else, you're the one that's actually going to be seen as at fault. And so you have to take extra due diligence to make sure that the actions of all of your customers is protected in ways that protects them from themselves as well. So hopefully over the last 20 minutes or so, you've had an opportunity to think about these new approaches to cloud security as it relates to Hyper-V, and how the host-based approach and some of the management solutions that facilitate that host-based approach may actually provide you with a better experience, and also at the end of the day, your customers with a better relationship with yourself and also with each other.